This lesson we're going to be using form data, constructing a form within the visual form construction in the Google Suite, and having that form data submit into a spreadsheet. And within the spreadsheet, we're going to be running some custom code in order to track the user's name, first name and last name, their email address, as well as the row that we've tracked the form submission into, and then constructing some JSON data that we can visually see if we want to debug the content that's been submitted. And the script, what it will do is it's going to send us an email to the user's first name and last name, construct some HTML code for a message within the email, and then also generate a PDF on the fly with the content submitted from the form that's going to get emailed out to the user. It's going to get emailed out to the user that submitted the form. In addition, it's going to send that email out to the administrator, which is going to be this default account for the form submission. That's all according to the settings in the app script. So it's only going to require 3 parameters, and of course you can customize this as needed. So fill out the form, and once it gets submitted, that form content is automatically going to be dropped into the spreadsheet using a event trigger on the form submission that we're also going to be showing you how you can set that up using code. It's going to send out the email there from the content that was just submitted. So that's all coming up in this lesson. Over to Drive, select under New, and select within the menu Google Forms. That will open up the Google Forms Builder. This is the visual builder where you can create a form. This will just be the test form number 1. So give it a name. You can also enter in a description. So I'm not going to do too much for the description. Setting up the form content. So this is all visually done. We can also do this with code, which I'll show you afterwards in the upcoming lesson. So within here, you can set up the various questions. You can import questions, add titles and descriptions, add images, add videos, and add sections. So let's go ahead and we're going to add a question. So the question is going to be asking for the first name of the user, short answer. This is also going to be a required field. You can duplicate this. You can also set descriptions and response validation as well. So let's go ahead and duplicate this. And the second question is going to be asking for the last name. And let's get rid of this one here, where we're going to be changing that from a multiple choice to providing the user's email. So changing it to a short question and email. And set this as a required as well. Make sure that this is going to be an email address. You can set a regular expression. You can set the parameters here for the conditions. You can also, under the settings, set up the responses, how the responses are collected and protected. Collecting the email addresses. Once you set that, that will automatically collect the email address and send the responders a copy of their response. And we'll just set that right now to requested. So it requires a sign-in. And because we want to collect the email address, we're going to ask the user to sign in automatically. There's also options for the defaults, so we can collect the email address by defaults. Going back to the questions, we can automatically remove, or we should remove this one because we're asking the email, so it's automatically asking the user's email address. So once you've completed the form, you're ready to launch the form. And in order to connect it to a spreadsheet, we can select under the responses and create a brand new spreadsheet to collect those responses. There's also, we can get an email notification for the responses. So there's a lot of settings already built in. Let's uncheck that. And within the spreadsheet, we're going to create a brand new spreadsheet for the responses. When we create a brand new spreadsheet for the responses, we can create a new sheet for it, or we can select an existing sheet. Let's go ahead and we're going to create a brand new sheet for the responses. And that's going to open up the spreadsheet where we've got the timestamp, the email address, the first and the last name that we're collecting within this spreadsheet. Now within the spreadsheet, we're going to select the extensions, open apps script, and that's going to open up the script editor where we can select and create a trigger that's going to run whenever the form content gets submitted. So give this one a name, and I'll call it test form 1. So that's going to be as a bound script to the spreadsheet, and we can set up the trigger either manually or we could do it with code. So let's go ahead and we're going to do it with code, and we're going to create a function called make trigger, and then we'll also create a function, I'll call it adder, and what this will do is this function will run within the new trigger. So using a variable, let's select the sheet object, and using the spreadsheet app class, we get the active sheet. So it's going to select the active sheet object. And then within the script app, this is where we can create a new trigger. So selecting the trigger and then the function that we want to run. So this is expecting a string name. So we're going to run the function adder. And because this is an object, we want to run the trigger for the spreadsheet. And this is where we add in the sheet object that we just selected from the active sheet. And then we look for the trigger on form submit. And then lastly, we just create the trigger. So this function will actually make the trigger. And the second function called adder is the one that's going to run whenever we get triggered and we select the content and add it into the spreadsheet. Open up the browser, and just to take a closer look at the Google Sheet events. And the one that we're selecting is the form submit. So the data that we're going to be accepting, so it does need to be authorized. We're going to be returning back the object containing the names and the values. The values are going to be contained within an array format. There's also the range, so it's representing the cell or the range cells that were edited. And also we're going to be selecting that triggered UI and the values that are contained within the UI. Go back into the sheet. We'll create another spreadsheet called log. And within the log spreadsheet, this is where we can select and update content into it. So using the spreadsheet app, and we're going to open the spreadsheet by ID. So this is also can be used when you are using a standalone script. Let's select the ID of the spreadsheet that we want to use. Open it by ID. So that's selecting the spreadsheet object and then selecting the sheet that we want to use. And this is going to be using a method that's called getSheetByName. The name of the sheet that we want to use is log. And so within the log object, we're going to retrieve the content that's sent into adder from the event. So selecting the spreadsheet, and let's stringify the event object. So use the JSON stringify to turn the object into a string value so that we could add it and append it to the sheet. So select the sheet, use the append row, and the row contents that we're going to be appending, so this is just going to be that JSON value. Let's run the code. So let's accept the permissions, the account that we want to use to accept the permissions. Under advanced, go to the application, read through the permissions that we're accepting, and if everything is okay, then just accept the permissions. Let's add the trigger using the make trigger function. And now whenever we go into the triggers of the application, there's our trigger that we've created. You can also select the trigger, make updates to the trigger. And I usually like to get notified immediately once if there are any errors. So that's going to send an email to the account that's created the spreadsheet object. I'm going to go ahead and open up my email. Let's save the trigger, accept the permissions for the update of the trigger that we've added into the code, and updating the trigger to be able to run the function that's contained within the app script, and that's going to be the adder code. We're going to get the security alert in the Google Mail that we can, and let's try to make a form submission. So going to the form submissions, hit the preview and that's going to open up the form submission. So there's the headings. That's the email that we're using. So it's asking for our email address. So we can just add that in. That's the same email that I'm logged in as. And then adding Svekis. You can send a copy, and this is just a default form action that is going to send a copy of the form that I've submitted. So that's what that's going to look like. When you open the log, we've logged content using the adder function, and that's all of the information that we've picked up, and this is the information that was submitted within the form. So if we want to send this information via an email whenever the form gets submitted, we can create a separate function that's going to construct an email and create a response for that email. And for the user, we are picking up their email address under the named values where we've got the email address. And this is a property that we can then use in order to output that content. I'll call it sender. And this is going to be sending that user information to the object. And we'll also create a test function that's going to test sending the object information into the sender function. So let's copy what we have here coming in from the eParameters, set it up as a test value, and this way we can select the content that we want to send to the sender. Let's log out into the log, information that we need. So under the object named values of test, so selecting test and named values, and actually let's update this to user and set that to user so that we can copy and paste the code into sender. So it's getting the named values, and one of the values that we need is the email address in order to be able to send the email to the user. So let's just make sure that we did select that properly. Run the code, and that gives us the email address. And it is within an object array format. So we want to select out the first item within the array, and that's just going to give us the string value of the email address. So that will return back the email. Next item that we want is we want to get the first name and the last name, and then send that user an email response and also notify us that we've got the response data coming from the sheet. So let's create an object called user. And within the object, we can set a value for the first name. And the first name is going to be coming from the user named values first. And then we also have the email. And we're also going to need last. So now let's update these named values. So for first, it's first. For last, it's going to be last, so the property name is last. And instead of outputting that, we'll output the user value. And this should be user info, as we've already used user. So just save that, and let's run the test. So that gives us the extracted information from the data. We also have the range of the cell. So we can use that if we want as well in order to send an update into the form responses, as that's going to be the range of where we've added in that new user. So in order to use that, and right now we'll just take the row start value. So that's coming from the user range property and using the row start value. So run that one more time. And well, we've got the row value that we're being able to extract from the user data. And this is from the event object that we've submitted. The user info from the event object, and we'll also send that out to be emailed. So that contains the user info. We're constructing the user info from the user object. Let's stringify the user info, and we'll append that information now onto the spreadsheet. So it's going to contain more detailed information. So in order to create an array from the object, now that we've got the within the user information object, select that and we'll convert that into an array, and that's what we're going to append to the row. So it's going to be a little bit cleaner. So using the object values method, add in the object that we want to use, which is user info. And that's going to convert the object content values into an array of values. And that's what we can add to the existing array. And then next, what we'll do is we're going to send this, and then we'll send out an email within the sender function. So save that and go back into the sheet. And we want to make it so that we can fill out the responses more than once. So remove that to limit it to once. And now we can fill it out a second time. Oh, this should be the email address. So go through filling out the form. And I'll just give it Laurence 2 and Svekis 2. We can send a copy of the responses. So go to the inbox. There we've got the form that's been filled out. So those are the values. And now when we go into the log, we've got the content being logged, but within there we're still retrieving back an object. And what this means is that we've tried to insert object data into where we're expecting a string value. So let's update this so that it's either not an array or that it's going to not be wrapped in an array. And because this is already an array, we don't have to wrap it with the array content. So let's try that one more time, where we set the email, submit the form, and this time we got the content being submitted properly. So we can remove out these other two existing rows. And now we're getting a much cleaner response of the content. We can also insert headers here. And this is going to correspond to the row within the form responses. So that's row number 4. So now that we're picking up the data object, we can now send it as an email to the user once the form is submitted. So send over to the sender object. We'll send the user information after we append the row. And user information is going to go to the function called sender. And within the sender function, we'll get the properties of the form values, because this is within an object format. So let's create, using HTML variable, we'll create a table so that's nicely structured. We can also do a row. And then as we loop through using for, we can get the key in the user object and loop through the data. So getting the key value is just going to be the key, and returning back the value that's coming from the user. And because it's an object, we can use the key within the bracket notation. And then for the HTML, we'll append to the HTML. So first create the HTML and then add in the value for the item in the HTML. And as we loop through, lastly, let's update the HTML object. And this is the data that we're going to be sending to the user. So close off the row, close off the table. And now let's send it as an email. And within the user object, we also have an email address. So using the mail app class and send email, we'll send an email object, an HTML email. So setting the property for to, and because we want to send this as an HTML email, this is where we can set the options for the content. And the parameters, it's actually not going to be to, it's going to be the recipient. So this is expecting a value for the recipient email, and we have that under the user email. The subject, so this can be, we can have some information that this is just the form submitted, and you can customize these as needed. The body, and we're going to send this as a HTML body. So we can update this to be HTML body, and this will set the rendering into HTML format. And this is where we can construct our HTML. Let's add a little bit to that. And then from here, we can just update and add to the HTML. And we can use some of the user's information. So we do have values for the user, for the first name, under user first. And because this is HTML, You can use HTML tags in there. You can add additional content in there. And depending on what you want to write in this email, you can also get some other options. If you have other input fields there within the form, you can pass them into the user object and then add them into the email. And let's add one more. So again, separate div, thank you, or we'll just write kind of a ending message. So that will construct the HTML that we're sending in the email and within the HTML email body. So let's try this one more time and just double check the code. So we're sending, so what's going to happen is that we've got a trigger that's listening for the form submit. Once the form gets submitted, it's going to run the function adder. Within the function adder, we're selecting the spreadsheet object, selecting it by ID. And the reason that I'm using it, opening it by ID, is that sometimes I've had issues when I'm doing the get active when the sheet is not actually opened. So that's why I'm selecting it by the ID as I would within a standalone application. And then we're selecting the sheet named log, constructing the user information from the event option where we've submitted the event information, and that's coming in under the variable user. We're stringifying it, and then we're also adding in and appending a row of content within the array. You can also add and stringify all of that user information if you want. You can push in the JSON data at the end of the array. So that will just add another field there in the spreadsheet and call it JSON. And one of the best practices is that as you're getting the form responses, don't edit the form content sheet. So leave this one as is and create a new sheet if you want to track the data that's coming from the form submission, as you don't want to be adding extra columns and data into the form that's not being submitted from the form, as you might encounter some errors down the line. And if you change any of these form names, so if you change the question name, so if you change it to first or first name, that's going to change. You're going to have to change the code as well, because this will no longer be that value. And you'll also see that the form responses, that data is changing as well within the spreadsheet. So be careful of when you make changes to that, to the form after you've created and added the code. So this will add and append the JSON to the end of the array, and we're using that array to append to the row. Once we have the data object, this was our sample of the data object. So we're sending the user information to a function called sender, constructing some HTML that we want to output, including the form information. And then lastly, just sending out the email. We also have an opportunity to CC. So let's CC. And this is requiring a email address. You can comma separate out the email addresses. I'll just CC it to my email address, and this is expecting a string value. If you have multiple email addresses, you can comma separate them here. So now we're ready to submit another response. Let's enter in the email address, number 5, so that they're unique values. Submit it. Go open up the logs. So there's our submission of the data. And that's the JSON object that we added. And then go to the inbox. So it looks like there was an error. And the reason that we're throwing the error was that we didn't accept permissions on the send email. So run the function, and any of the functions within the script will trigger the form, the submission, and the acceptance of the email permissions. So there's the send email as you. So that's the permissions that we were missing. So it looks like we need to fill that out one more time. So add the email address, and this time use another value. So we use 6, submit it, and let's see what happens. So it looks like that came in properly. We should have permissions. So now we've got the form submitted. So we don't have any errors this time, and the form submitted okay, where we constructed the content that we were sending to the user. Thank you for submitting the form. And this is the data that we've constructed. So let's add one more line of code where we're going to we'll construct the HTML. We can also construct a PDF directly from content. And here we're already generating some HTML content. So let's create a PDF on the fly using the utilities method and create a new blob. And the blob contents is going to be the HTML. Set the meme type and the meme type that we're expecting so that it's HTML content. And this is how you can generate a PDF on the fly. So with the blob, let's set a name for the blob. And this name can be, and it's expecting a string value for the name. So I'm going to just add in and get the data so that it's getting the user's name there and setting it as the email. And for the email, as we're sending it out, we can set an attachment now of the PDF that we've generated. So this is a PDF that we've generated on the fly. You can also create PDFs and save them to your drive as well. And getting the blob object, get as, and get the blob object. And again, we need to set the meme type. So the meme type for this is going to be a PDF. And let's just set this as a PDF file name with the extension PDF. Let's run the function again. So everything looks like it should be working properly. We should also be able to send that user information to the sender for testing, so that this time we don't always have to fill out the form. That's why it's good to have a test function that you could run and run tests of your function with. Let's check out what we've got here. So we've got form submitted, and there's our PDF that we generated on the fly. And that's going to be the same as the HTML. And of course, you can customize and change it as needed. You fill out the email address and the last name. And you might have to go through it several times just to make sure that everything is working as expected. So now it looks like we sent ourselves the email. We constructed the HTML email content. There we've got the row for the data that we've submitted. And that's the PDF that we've generated on the fly and also sent the email out to the user. And this is all done with AppScript. And then, of course, we are logging the data into the spreadsheet log. And then these are just the default form data that's coming in by default directly into the form. And that was set up when we set up the form. So go ahead and create your own version of this application so that you too can send emails. You can use this as an auto response when someone submits a form content and customize the email that's being generated and sent out to the user.